Okay, so okay, now we are live on YouTube and ready to start our seminar. First, hello everyone, and thank you for coming and joining our fine seminar for today. My name is Adriana Maldonado Chaparro, and I'm a professor at Universidad de Rosario in Colombia. I am host of this seminar this week, and I'm really happy to have you all here today. So before I start with this seminar, I first want to thank our previous speaker, Corina Logan, for her talk on human modified environments and flexibility, and also open science framework. Second, I just want to announce that our speaker for next week, Lucy Aplin, she cannot make it. She's doing a transition to Australia, and at the moment she's over there, so it will be 1 in the morning if she gives a talk. So we understand this, but we reschedule her for next seminar series, so we'll have her in October with us. Which means that next week we don't have anything planned, but we'll resume on June 21st with Niels Dingemans, and he'll be talking about understanding individual behavior and key role for social environments. Also, we already have a preliminary program for next series. We're gonna start with Erika van der Wal from University of Lausanne, and we'll follow also with a small, let's say, mini seminar from young African researchers that we want to highlight. We're going to have this seminar or this schedule list and published in our Twitter account as well as our website. So please check it out. And we're also going to send out our regular weekly reminders. So no worries about it. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Elizabeth Hobson. Dr. Elizabeth Hobson, she got her PhD in New Mexico State in 2013, if I recall correctly. And then she did 2 postdocs, one at the National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis, NIMBIOS, as we often recognize it. This is at the University of Tennessee. That was from 2014 to 2016. And then in 2016, she moved to the Santa Fe Institute, where she also spent about 2 more years until she got her current position in 2019 as an assistant professor at University of Cincinnati. And there she's been like super active in different, both educational and research activities, engaging with, for example, the zoo and different type of systems. Her research focuses on social information mostly, and she aims to understand what animals know about their social worlds, how they come to know it, and what do they do with that information. To address these kind of questions, her lab develops and applies new quantitative tools, especially those related with social networks, as we're going to see today. And she integrates different aspects of ecology, evolution with state-of-the-art technology, computational approaches, and field experiments. Well, Liz has a lot of collaborations throughout the world, and she works with different systems, some of them to highlight ants, penguins, and bats more recently, among others. But her lab focuses mostly on parakeets, and now she's taking a challenge to set up a new system on quails. On top of everything, she's got an impressive publication records and contributes strongly to a diversity of journals in our fields, such as animal behavior, field trans, biological reviews, ProcB, behavioral ecology, well, and others in the list. I don't want to keep extending this introduction, so the seminar title is Dominance, Hierarchies, by Decisions and Social Support as Windows into Animal Social Cognition. So Liz, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and please, the mic is all yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Adriana. Thanks for that great introduction. So I'm gonna share the screen. That looks okay. Oh, good. Super. And if anything comes up, I've got the chat window open. So if anything needs clarifying or something like that, feel free to drop it in the chat. All right, so great. So today, the plan for today is to, like Adriana mentioned in her intro, to show you how I blend these kind of empirical approaches with experimental manipulations with some computational tools to get more insight into animal decision making. So I really like to bring sociality and cognition together to understand what animals need to know in order to act in the ways that they do, that we see in the real world. So I'll highlight some very new results linking sociality and cognition today in the parakeets, and I'll show you how to give us insight into how and why social systems change over time, so the dynamics of relationships and group level processes. So what I'll do is show you how these new patterns are fitting in with our previous results that are coming from more computational angles, and how those are giving us more insight into how this one species builds and functions within its social world. But then I'll finish with a broader perspective on how we can use comparative studies to understand these links between sociality and cognition more generally to understand social dynamics. Okay, so I want to start out with kind of the general introduction is, thinking about sociality. So sociality provides a lot of benefits to individuals within groups, but it also involves intra-group competition. So to visualize this, we can think of these female lions here, which are forming affiliative bonds with each other. They're cooperating with those same individuals to repel external threats, for example, but they're then potentially turning around and competing with those very same individuals for access to some like a limited resource. And so animals are constantly kind of balancing the costs and benefits of being social in a lot of these groups. And they also must constantly decide who to interact with and how to interact with those individuals. And this kind of processing happens regardless of which species it is, right? So in different species, they're balancing these costs and benefits in different ways, but there's always this balancing approach, and there's always some kind of information coming into the system that they're making decisions on. So we can think of this information and decision making in a cycle. So individuals would be going back and forth between collecting, taking in information, and then using that information in some way to make a decision about how to move forward in their social worlds. So we can think of maybe these chickens here in a social group. Chickens are classic for thinking about dominance hierarchies, as we'll see in a minute. So let's think about the group of chickens. They're all interacting with each other. And let's focus on this one particular individual here. So that individual is taking in some kind of information from the environment, from all of the interactions that it's seeing around itself. And then that individual could then be using that information, processing it, filtering it somehow through its cognitive abilities, and then making a decision of how to interact in the future based on whatever information it has remaining after that process. And then it's going back and interacting with its group. And so we can look at this from the perspective of a single individual, but the same process is happening for all the individuals in the group. So you can see this kind of sawtooth pattern that emerges between information collection, processing, and then use of the information. And so future decisions can be based at least partially on these past events. And so there's momentum in a lot of these social systems. So having this information about sociality can be important for making these decisions on a moment-by-moment basis, but we also know that sociality is a moving target itself, right? We know that social worlds are changing over time, and the information that individuals are collecting has to keep up with the pace that their social worlds are changing. And so two common ways that social worlds change over time are for changes to group membership, so via something like a demographic process. So this is a figure adapted from Shizuka and Johnson 2020, a recent paper on these processes, where you can see individuals are departing from a social group, leaving a gap in the social network, or they're coming into a social group and forming new relationships, new structures within those groups. We can also think of changes over time due to relationships between particular individuals that are weakening or strengthening through time. And so in both of these cases, if the individuals in the group use a lot of information to make decisions about who to interact with in the future, this social information gathering process can be really open-ended and require sustained attention, memory, and updating from the individuals in these groups. So cognition can be a really critical part of thinking about how and why these individuals are interacting. And the more that animals, know about their social worlds, the better they might be able to balance the costs and benefits of sociality. And so one of the things I find really intriguing about animal sociality is that as researchers, we can take advantage of this process. And essentially, it goes in one direction for the animals, but as researchers, we can drive it backwards using cognitive tools and creative experiments to try to figure out, okay, based on how the animals were interacting, what could they have known in order to act in the ways that they do? Okay, so doing that kind of thing, we have to be careful, right? Can't just go in and assume it's a cognitive process. They remember everything. They are using, complex math to figure all these things out and integrating across, who knows how many years of information. So we really have to do this carefully. So connecting social processes to the underlying cognition is tricky. And I wanted to highlight a recent preprint that I saw going around on Twitter from Guest and Martin, which had this beautiful quote in there, which said, correlation does not imply cognition, right? This is so critical when you're thinking about connections between sociality and cognition, because just because a model, as they say in the paper, just because it correlates with brain or behavior data, or in our case, social data, it's not sufficient for us to infer that the model is performing cognition. We haven't, identified that cognition is definitely taking place. It's just the possibility of it. So one thing that I want to highlight that we do in the lab is to use kind of an integrative approach, kind of a three-part integrative approach to really carefully go through and say, okay, where's the potential for cognition? And then go in more specifically and say, okay, let's test it. We think that they're doing something interesting with recognition, for example. Let's go in and see, do they recognize the things that we think that they should be recognizing? So it's going back between kind of these behavioral observations, the experimental manipulations, and the computational modeling. And in order to get at these connections, we really kind of jump back and forth between the approaches quite a bit. And so we do all that also in the context of comparing within a single species, like I'll show you today with the parakeets, but also across lots of different species to try to see how general are these patterns across different social species. And that's a big goal of the lab, is to identify these generalities. So all of this led us in the lab to focus on three major questions. So what do animals know about their social worlds? How do they perceive, process, and store that information? That's the cognitive angle. And then how can they use that information to make decisions? So in a lot of ways, you can think about the dynamics of changes in social structure and changes in social relationships as driven by a kind of a trio of these three factors. So I think that power, social support, and this information are really the three critical things to understand when you're thinking about how social systems are changing over time. What I'll show you today is the work that we've done on the connections between mostly power and information, but then we'll get back to the importance of social support towards the end of the talk today. So focusing in on power and information, what I want to argue today is that aggression, conflict, and social dominance can be used as kind of a model system to study the feedbacks between sociality and cognition. Now, dominance hierarchies have a really long history of studies. So they were first described in chickens as peck order in 1922 in this classic paper. And this paper is widely considered to be the foundation of the field. And since then, we've documented structured aggression and dominance hierarchies in groups across the animal kingdom. So this paper, just to highlight a couple things in here, is just filled with these absolute gems. So one of the quotes, for example, is, anyone who thinks the inhabitants of a chicken yard are thoughtless, happy creatures with a daily life of undisturbed pleasure is thoroughly mistaken. A grave seriousness lies over the chicken yard. And I think this is just, papers used to be so poetical, right? So it's definitely worth a read. But this year actually marks about 100 years of research on hierarchies and ranks since that foundational paper. So if you're interested in kind of a broad overview of the history of dominance hierarchy research, both from a historical perspective and the cutting edge of what's going on right now in the field, I point you towards the special issue that just came out earlier this year. And I think taking this historical perspective on the field is really kind of an interesting way of thinking about the history of scientific ideas. And for me, this historical perspective was really striking. So for example, these little word clouds that have popped up here come from a science of science approach that I use to look for a historical use of words in the titles of publications associated with dominance hierarchies across the history of the publications. And so looking across decades of research showed me that interest in hierarchies has been high and sustained across the history, but that the field appears to be becoming much more interdisciplinary in recent decades. And I think that's really exciting because that allows for much more of a merger of interdisciplinary ideas and tools and approaches from other disciplines to all be integrated into understanding animal sociality and cognition. So the reason that I think hierarchies, aggression, and conflict are such a good model for linking social and cognitive research is because of the costs and the benefits and the decision-making process that animals use to choose their fights. So for example, if you're an animal in the system, you do not want to choose to fight the most dominant individual in the group that's going to potentially injure you severely, right? So there's a big cost-benefit weighing that happens in choosing fights. The same thing, you don't want to be too passive and miss out on a lot of resources. And so there is a constant kind of decision-making process about how to interact in some of these systems, especially when the dominance hierarchies are forming. So what I'm going to do today is, as I said, integrate the previously published results on the parakeets from data like this that I collected all the way back in 2008. And now you'll see some new data from my group from last year's field season in 2021. So this is work led by my postdoc, Anna Marie van der Marel, with support from my PhD students, Claire O'Connell, Xavier Francis, Chelsea Carmenito, and our postdoc, Cesar Estienne, who's now a PhD student at Berkeley. So you'll see all these people crop up at various points during the talk. Okay, so what I'll show you today, as I said, is how I've been using these parakeets and their aggression and hierarchies as a window into animal social cognition. So I'll first give you an overview of dominance hierarchies in the parakeet system, and then I'll describe results that we've found at 2 social scales. So we'll start at the individual scale, and we'll ask this question here. Can individuals rejoin groups and retake their previous rank after a forced separation? At the group level, we'll ask, can small changes in group membership induce a group level change in social dominance patterns? So both of these are really focused on the dynamics of the system, but going into a system and kind of giving it a little kick and seeing experimentally, did that kick induce any overall changes in the system? Okay, so the monk parakeets are native to temperate South America, and they're notable for both their really highly social nature and also their success as invasive species. So you can see here from their native range in yellow, they've been transported worldwide by the pet trade and have formed many feral populations. So I've worked with some of the wild populations in Argentina and also captive populations in Florida to form the foundation of what sociality looks like in these birds. So today I'm going to focus on the captive data. And in captivity, our general methods revolve around observing and experimenting with these groups of individuals in large outdoor flight pens. So the first step is we need to recognize everybody so we know who's who. So what we do is we take the very technical method of drawing all over their faces with Sharpie markers. And you can see the color combinations here. So we've got all of them named by their 3 color combos. So on the head, the cheeks, and the neck. So you can see, for example, Bob there is blue, orange, blue. So they've all got the 3-letter combos. So we have no evidence that all of these marks change their behavior. And this is also a captive group, so we don't have to worry about these marks causing problems with predation and things like that. So once they're marked, we release all of the birds into a large semi-natural flight pen. And then the crew goes and records all of the observations over time. So we record things like location data, behaviors, and interactions. And as an example of the interactions, you can see here 3 kinds of interaction data that we collect. So nearest neighbor, who's nearest to who. So that's a proximity kind of behavior. And then interactions, 2 of the kinds are affiliation, which here you can see one bird is alloprene, the other bird. And we also collect data on obviously aggression, who's fighting with who starts the fight, who wins. We do this all using an electronic data collection method using the Animal Observer app. And this allows us to, in real time, recalculate the hierarchies every night following a day of observation, which is really critical, as you'll see later, to some of our experimental methods. So what we do with all the fights is we rank the individuals based on the fights. So here you can see aggression happening between 2 parakeets. So we record the actor and the target in all of those events, and then assemble it into a matrix here that shows how many times individuals are winning fights against all other individuals in their group. Then we use a ranking method. There are a lot of ranking methods that you can use, but I really like this rank embedding method that's a modified version of PageRank, which takes the whole aggression network into account to figure out the rank of these individuals. And for more details, you can, I'll point you towards that 2021 paper there. Basically, once we get the ranks, that gives us a continuous measure of power of all the individuals, which we can then use to order the individuals into rank spots. So here you can see the headshots of the birds from the high-ranked individuals at the top and the low-ranked individuals at the bottom. Okay, so previous results on monk parakeet dominance that were focused on this computational approach and working with a stable social system, mostly stable, and trying to detect, without perturbing the system, what do we think is going on the cognitive side? What we found is that hierarchies were structured and they formed really quickly in these novel groups that we established. Parakeets integrated their own experiences and observations to choose their fights. And we also found that rank was not correlated with individual characteristics like body size or weight, space use, or call characteristics, or pretty much anything else that we could measure. And so we concluded from these computational approaches that rank is likely a social product in these groups. And this is collaborative work, especially with Simon DeDeo. So what we did with these computational approaches is identify, we think it's social, and we think it's probably based on things like memory and inference on the cognitive side. But what we can go in and now do experimentally is, as I said, let's kick the system a little bit and let's see, is it really? So what we've done with the new experiments is see what kind of new insight can we gain from studying how rank and social dominance are changing when we perturb the system. Okay, so I'll run you through our perturbation experiments, but let's start with the individual level question. So can individuals rejoin groups and retake their previous rank after a forced separation? So here, to do these perturbations experimentally, what we do is we do targeted removal and replacements, reintroductions of top-ranked parakeets. So here's our timeline. So we've got, at first, we allow birds to interact. We allow the hierarchies to stabilize. Then what we go in and do is identify the top ranked bird by pooling over 3 days of observations. Then we trap all the birds and we figure out the top ranked bird, we remove that bird from the social group and isolate it in a completely different area. Then we release the rest of the group back into the flight pen, allow the hierarchy to restabilize over the course of the next 8 days. And then what we do is go in and reintroduce that removed individual. And we see how it reintegrates into the group. So what we're comparing is the rank of that removed individual prior to the removal and following the reintroduction of that individual. Okay, and this entire process for one perturbation takes 16 days. And so what I'm going to show you today is from 2021, where we had 3 perturbations. So caveats, sample size is 3, right? So keep that in mind. But I think the results that we're finding are really intriguing. And we're also following up this, this study that I'll present today with more replications. So keep that in mind too. Okay, so what we did in 2021, we used 20 birds in the large flight pen. We did 3 social perturbations. So you can see the headshots of the 3 birds that we perturbed in perturbations 1, 2, and 3. And along the course of these perturbations, we were recording all of the fights. So these parakeets, they fight a lot. So during the observation period here, we saw over 20,000 fights. Okay, so let's look at each of those. So, okay, the first perturbation that we did, blue, 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 was the top ranked individual. We removed it and then reintroduced it to the group. When it came back into the group, it was ranked absolutely bottom of the entire hierarchy. So it suffered a huge rank loss on reintroduction. Next bird, we had green, purple, green ascended to the top of the hierarchy. And on reintroduction, that bird suffered a large loss, not quite as great as the first individual, but quite a striking loss of rank on reintroduction. And the third bird, orange, purple, purple here, who ascended to top rank after that, suffered also a major loss in rank on reintroduction. So if we look at this all together, what you can see here is in the background, all the other birds and how their ranks are changing. And what you can see is that our perturbed birds are suffering a huge rank loss compared to everybody else in the group. So loss of rank and power scores were much more extreme for the removed birds than for others in the group. And what this is showing us is that, what we think is showing us is that social history really seems to matter in monk parakeet rank. So these birds that were top ranked initially cannot just waltz back in after an absence and retake their rank. They have to work for it. So none of the birds were able to retake their previous rank immediately after reintroduction. And we think that, again, the social history is really probably important in the rank dynamics. So one thing here is, in this study, we only perturbed the top ranked individuals. So we don't know if this same pattern also functions for other ranked individuals. So as just a taste of stuff to come, we're still analyzing the data, but we did additional experiments that just concluded in the 2022 field season, where we've got 2 replicate social groups, and we're looking at how the group responds to the perturbation of the top ranked birds, but also the middle and the low ranked birds. And then we also said, okay, how does the group respond to strangers, right? Because that could also be something that would be interesting to look at here. And we also looked at how consistent these group level responses are. Okay, so social history seems to matter. And these new perturbation experiments are lining up really well with the previous computational results. So again, it's 2 separate lines of evidence here that are now showing that rank is likely an emergent social property in groups. And what we show here is that birds seem to be unable to retain their ranks when they're experimentally removed. And this might be due to the fact that they're not present and interacting and maintaining kind of their role within the social group. All right, so let's go over to the group level. So here, if we shift over to what everybody in the whole group is doing, kind of the remaining birds, right? outside of that focal bird that we perturbed. We can use the same perturbation experiment, but different analyses to get that group level perspective. So we can ask here, can small changes in group membership induce a group level change in social dominance patterns for the whole group? And so here again, initially we had used computational methods to infer what parakeets know about the rank of their own rank and the rank of others in their group. So here you can see how, as I explained before, we get the ranks of the individuals in the group. But importantly, those ranks are based on a network of interactions. So what we can go back in and do is say, if we rewire that aggression network and change the rank information, does that change how the birds are fighting on a fight by fight kind of basis? So we can ask questions like, how is conflict structured by rank information? We can say, are animals just following the basic rules of the hierarchy, or is there more structure to aggression decisions? And so this is previous computational work that I did with Dan Munster and more work that I did with Simon Dedeo. What we did is come up with 3 potential social dominance patterns. So we have the downward heuristic is just follow the hierarchy, attack anybody who's ranked lower than you kind of indiscriminately. A close competitor's pattern would be attack anybody ranked lower than yourself, but only slightly below. And bullying is attack anybody ranked below yourself, but like focus on the bottom, the furthest ranked individuals from your own rank in the hierarchy. So to visualize this, you can think of the aggression network over here, and let's focus on this individual in particular. So what do the strategies look like from that individual's perspective? And we redo this for each individual's perspective in the hierarchy. But for that individual, the downward heuristic would result in all of these individuals ranked lower than itself being potential targets of aggression. Close competitors suggest that it should focus its aggression just on a particular subset of individuals that are ranked slightly below itself. And then for bullying, it should focus its aggression on the ones that are far below itself at the bottom of the hierarchy. So we developed a new way of thinking about how to rewire and model these hierarchies. So I'll point you in the direction of a paper that I co-led with Matt Silk and a lot of other collaborators that came out last year for kind of the conceptual background of these reference models. But in brief, what we do for these approaches to try to figure out, are the real patterns something interesting that we wouldn't expect from a less structured pattern, is you can approach these interactions in 2 ways. You can say, okay, we have the real patterns. Let's break part of the observed structure and see, do we break something critical? You can come the other direction and model these patterns from the ground up using agent-based models and things like that. And for that perspective, we can try to build part of the observed patterns and then say, did we build in something that's potentially essential? Can we get the modeled patterns to converge with what we see in the real world? So you can think of that here with this graphic. So we've got the observed patterns where the structural rules causing those patterns are unknown. We got the simulated patterns where the structural rules are either imposed by the model or imposed by this kind of sequential breaking of the patterns that we do. And then we compare those 2 together and we say, okay, if the match is good, then the modeled mechanism could potentially have generated the observed social patterns. Again, being careful about the cognitive side of this whole process. What we find when we look across lots and lots of different species, these are results for 85 different species across 172 social groups. You can see them grouped by order here. And we find that social dominance patterns occurred across groups, occurred in groups across these taxa. So we had the bulk of the groups were following a downward heuristic, just basically following the basic dominance hierarchy rules. But 22% of these groups are following these, what we think of as more complex strategies that are based on a little bit more information about the relative rank differences between individuals. So 13% were following this close competitors pattern, and 9% were following a bullying pattern. Interestingly, if we look within species where we have multiple groups with this historical data reported, what we find is that sometimes these groups are actually showing different social dominance patterns. So for the 37 species where we had multiple social groups reported, 17 of them had multiple social dominance patterns. And what you can see highlighted here is that 3 species showed evidence that different groups were following all 3 of those social dominance patterns. So this is really striking, but we can't figure out why from the purely computational approach here. So the question then is, why do groups follow these different social dominance patterns, and how flexible are particular groups? So here, what we wanted to do is to go in, use the same perturbation pattern that we used before, and we'll go in and we'll kick the system again, and we'll say, okay, is the removal of a single individual sufficient to trigger a shift in the group's social dominance pattern? So how can we get the group to change its pattern in real time? So here to analyze this, we look at data before and after the removals, so highlighted here in blue, and then before and after the reintroductions in that other blue section. But again, we're looking at the group level perspective here instead of the individual level perspective. So what we find is after removals, which you can see here highlighted with the headshots with the X's through them, what happens is that the social dominance patterns are variable. So you can see that in one case, it changed from bullying to a downward heuristic. The other case, it's staying as a bullying pattern. The third case, it's staying as a downward heuristic. So we see a lot of variability in how those social dominance patterns are shifting after removals. After reintroductions, we see a different pattern. So here you can see that we see a lot more consistency in how the dominance pattern is shifting, and is consistently shifting from a downward heuristic pattern to a bullying pattern. So if we look at the networks here, you can see this is an example from the first perturbation. You can see on the left-hand side is before removal, that perturbed, removed individual is at the top of the hierarchy there. And then you can see the network of the entire aggression network of how all the individuals are connected and interacting with each other. So here, the blue interactions are when a higher ranked individual won against a lower ranked individual. The red are the rule breakers, right? Where a lower ranked individual won a fight against a higher ranked individual. And the width of those lines are how often those 2 individuals interacted. What you can see is that upon reintroduction, again, that individual re-entered the group at the very bottom of the hierarchy. But you can also see in this perspective that it's getting a ton of aggression directed towards it. This is really consistent across all 3 of our perturbations, is that reintroduced bird got a lot of aggression directed at it and really precipitated this shift to the group level bullying pattern. Now, interestingly, a lot of the other aspects of the dominance hierarchy remained stable. Okay, so when we looked at whether group level patterns could be shifted by these removals of just a single key individual from the group, we found that perturbing the system in this way could trigger a shift in the social dominance pattern, but it was only consistent after the reintroductions and not consistently after the removals. So what we think is that this reintroduction phase could be an interesting one to look at because it's a lot more typical in social dynamics of a lot of social systems for individuals, if they're lost from the system, to be gone, right? They're maybe predated, maybe they died in some other way, maybe they moved to a different group. So in systems like the parakeets, where it's not typical to have long-term fission fusion behavior, their fission fusion is more on the scale of hours and kind of within a single day. The disappearance of an individual from the group is likely to mean that that individual is not coming back. Whereas in the reintroductions that we're doing, that should be biologically a strange event for these birds. So we think that that might potentially be triggering some of these patterns that we see. And that's going to be something that we're going to investigate in more detail in future experiments. The other thing that I wanted to highlight from these experiments is I talked about power, information, and social support all being kind of this triad of really important factors to consider in social dynamics. But we haven't really gotten into the social support side yet. We do have some indications now that it's potentially a very critical factor to consider in these dynamics. So I'll give you a couple indications of where we're thinking of going with that. So what we think now is heterogeneity in social support may be critical in explaining rank changes. So you can see here 2 individuals with a strong social bond who are allopreening each other. In the parakeets, they seem driven to form strong partnerships with 1 to a few other individuals. And if we perturb the system, they can actually repair on a very, very short timeline within a couple of hours. So what happened on the social side, social support side with these perturbations are a couple interesting things. So what we saw is that the first 2, the first and the third perturbation were cases where the bird initially had a strong partnership with, in the first case, 1 other individual, in the third case, 2 other individuals. And when it rejoined the group, it found that in both cases, those partners had moved on and were not accepting the reintroduced bird back into the partnership. So social support in those cases was fractured. In the case where the bird rejoined the social group and suffered a strong loss of rank, but not quite as critical as the other 2, what happened there is that bird was able to rejoin his previous partners. And so we think potentially that stable social support may be serving to buffer some of these rank changes that the individuals are undergoing. And so more experiments are going to focus more specifically on this aspect. Okay. So what I've shown you today overall is evidence that we think rank is an emergent social property in these groups. So none of the removed birds were able to retake their previous rank, and rank was not associated with static or dynamic characteristics from other work. So that's work that you can look at the preprint to see those results. We also found that removing 1 bird shifted the social dominance patterns so that groups are switching to a bullying pattern after every reintroduction, while basic things about the dominance hierarchy were being retained and were stable. And then I've shown you also some preliminary indications that social support might be critical in these systems. So the reintroduced birds who rejoined previous relationships did not suffer as extreme a drop in rank as the ones that whose relationships were fractured. So basically what we're doing next is to take all of this information that we have on the connections between power and information and really integrate social support into the equation here. So we planned out a new series of experiments that will allow us to manipulate interactions between all 3 of these factors to better understand the links between social dynamics and cognition. And not just in parakeets. So we're planning all these parallel experiments in other systems so that we can more directly compare the results. So we're also, on a broader scale, using all of this social drama, which is really exciting for a lot of people. People get interested in all the ins and outs of these relationships forming and breaking apart. Are we using that to motivate training for undergraduates in the basics of data science? And so I just wanted to highlight here, we're developing a couple different methods, but one is this sociality game that I'm developing with a whole bunch of collaborators that I nerd sniped into this project. And we're helping students hopefully develop model thinking skills and basic data science foundations as they go through and play these games. So as a taste of our other systems, I mentioned that we work on a lot of different systems, and we're trying to push these parallel experiments to a place where we can do comparative work across lots of different species. Here you can see a network diagram of my lab group. So they're all connected to their major study species here. including in collaboration with Jerry Carter's lab on vampire bat cooperation and sociality. And as Adriana mentioned, I started my group in 2019 here at the University of Cincinnati. And we've grown really quickly to form a really strong and very collaborative team. And this dynamic is making exciting cross-species and cross-study comparisons really feasible. So I'd like to thank everybody in the lab for their enthusiasm, their skills, and persisting through what's been a really challenging time with the pandemic. So with that, I'd like to thank the institutions and the funders that have supported this work. And I'd be happy to kick off our discussion section with all of your questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Liz. It was a great talk. So I am keeping an eye on the YouTube channel. Please type in your questions. I'll make sure to give them to Liz. And everyone, you know the drill. Just type in the question mark. I'll call your name and then you can open your mics. Please don't forget to state your affiliation and your name. We're trying to build community. So encourage introductions. I think our first question comes from Gloriana.
Thank you, Liz. What a wonderful talk. Gloriana Chaverri from the University of Costa Rica. And my question is about the decision of the time that you selected for removing those individuals and then reintroducing them, and thinking about, whether you would find a particular moment where you would clearly see those differences in, in the change of, the level in the hierarchy, but also thinking a bit about the idea of those affiliative behaviors and their partners, and how interesting I find that, because maybe it has to do a lot with losing some of those affiliative relationships the time that you will leave them out, more than the change of the whole interaction with the whole network. So I don't know, what's your perspective about that?
Yeah. So it's definitely the choice of that time period was a balance between how quickly do we think that the hierarchy can come back to a stable situation, right? Because you don't want to perturb, and then just create a hierarchy that crumbles, right? So if we want to keep rank as a relevant factor, then we have to have enough time between perturbations to allow the hierarchy to reestablish and kind of re-solidify. And so some of that was based on previous results on like how quickly those hierarchies come together. But you're right that the choice of how long between the perturbations could definitely have an effect. So here, the good thing with the parakeets is that the hierarchies can reform on a pretty quick timeline. And it turns out they also repair and repartner on also a very quick timeline. So that allows us to get some of this replication in these groups on a timeline that, makes replication within a feasible field season length, right? So this past field season, we did 5 months of field work, and we were able to get through, I think 7 perturbations total. So these just take a long amount of time. So it's always a constant balancing act between we want replication, but we can't perturb the system so quickly that everything just starts to crumble. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And then our next question comes from Marin.
Isn't Filippo first?
Yes, my bad. Sorry, didn't mean to. Filippo, you come first.
Okay. I'm Filippo Relli from Universidad de Veracruzana in Mexico. Thanks, Liz. I really enjoyed the talk, and I enjoyed this graph that you showed of the 3 birds together and so on. The part that I didn't understand was maybe related to the previous question is the timing. So we are talking about days, weeks, months, was not clear. And the reason I'm asking is because at least for the first 2 birds, the third one was not presented. There was pretty clear that it came up at the top of the hierarchy. So although they went at the bottom, they went very quickly, but I don't know now the quickly because I don't know the time scale up to the top. tells, I think, a very complementary story to what the one you told us. There are, I don't know if there are individual characteristics or there's the history that comes back, because clearly, this individual on the top of the hierarchy had a very long history of winning. Then clearly they were bullied for probably a short amount of time. So I think looking at the data, I'm sure you're doing it. I'm telling more maybe for everybody. I'm sure you are very aware of those patterns. At least for the next talk, I guess, is that it will be interesting from the individual point of view, how they reach that position. And of course, for the hierarchy point of view, if then you get back to the structure, the grade, I don't remember now what it was called, the one that you're going against everybody below you and not only the bullying part.
Yeah, that's a great spot. So good eyes on that, because that's part that is in there and I showed in the plot, but definitely didn't focus on. So you're totally correct that what's happening is that top ranked bird is coming out, we reintroduce it, the rank just tanks, right? But they're able to claw their way back up over time. And so those are all 16-day perturbation cycles. So what you're looking at is 3 of those 16-day cycles on those plots. So it's not immediate, right? Immediately they suffer this huge rank loss. And then it takes them some time to claw their way back. And so that's one thing that you're totally right. We're also looking at is how long does it take them to retake something like their previous rank. So in none of the cases was the removed bird able to retake top rank within the time span that we had in the study here. So it does seem that, these ranks are shifting over time. But again, the hierarchy structure itself is not crumbling and reforming in a completely different way. So hierarchies from time point to time point are highly correlated with each other, although the individuals are shifting a little bit in rank.
Okay, is that good, Filippo?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I was nodding. Thank you.
Okay, so Maren, we come with you next.
I'm at the University of Derby in the UK. So my original question was pretty much the same that Filippo and Gloriana have asked as well. So about the time frame, because you focused on the first 3 days. But I was also wondering, because you talked about the downward heuristic approach towards being aggressive to other individuals. Is there the possibility that some individuals actually have an upward idea? So attack who is slightly above you so that you can climb up the ladder, and whether that could be related to the fact that these originally top-ranked individuals who go bottom are able to, as you say, claw their way upwards again.
Yeah, no, I love this question because yes, definitely. And that's actually another related project that we're focusing on. So my PhD student, Xavier Francis, is looking at kind of the fight-by-fight decisions. And so what you're highlighting is if a bird is opportunistic, right, and is targeting individuals that are ranked above itself in rank, what happens is when you pool across several days of data, that bird looks like it's higher ranked, right? You don't get that moving of the rank dynamics. So depending on how long you're pooling the data across, that can be critical in detecting whether or not that kind of strategy is happening. So what Xavier and I are working on is a method where you can kind of in real time on a fight-by-fight basis say, oh, that individual, it just fought against a higher ranked individual, right? And then we can in real time kind of see how it's making those decisions. So we're not there yet, but definitely we're going in that direction. I think another thing on the time frame, right? Because people seem excited about, what time frame we're working with here. One of the things we did discuss was what if we push the perturbations to closer together to try to ruin the hierarchy, right? Like how much perturbation do you have to have for the whole group for the entire hierarchy to crumble. And one thing that is tricky with that is that the capture events are stressful for the birds. And so it does take them some time to recover. And so we pushed it a little bit faster, but we were seeing a lot of stress with the birds. And so this is pretty much the kind of the happy medium between lots of things change within this period, but the hierarchy is pretty maintained and the birds don't seem as stressed out.
Nice, thank you. We have 2 more questions and then I'll take a question from the YouTube. So YouTube, just wait a little bit. Our next question comes from Baptiste.
Hello, I'm Baptiste Sadugui. I'm a PhD student at the German Primate Center and the University of Göttingen, working on primate sociality. Thank you very much for the talk and some truly amazing graphs, putting all those dynamic hierarchies together so clearly. So thanks. I was wondering, because of the social cognition that you mentioned at the start, and then quickly mentioning also the wild populations that you might study, do you have the feeling the reintroduction of the bird and this shift to a bullying technique is something rather natural? So this is the way they would anyway go towards a new immigrating member? Or there is something a bit specific that gives you maybe the intuition that they know who is coming back, they know that they need this guy to stay at the bottom of the hierarchy, and this is the way to go bullying it. Do you have, even if you don't yet have all the data, but do you have a guess on this?
Yeah, so we did a couple experiments, right? And this is a critical thing, is like, is this just happening because they forgot who that guy was, right? And they're treating it like a stranger. And so what the crew did while that bird was removed is to do playback experiments to see, does the group still respond to the calls of that bird in ways that are different from the calls from a stranger bird? What we're finding so far is evidence that the group does remember and respond to that removed bird during the removal process. And that bird's also, when it was accepted back into its partnerships, it's accepted immediately back into the partnerships. So I think both lines of evidence are suggesting that the birds are not treating this as a total unknown stranger they forgot, within the 8 days who this guy was. But what we did in this past field season, which we're still analyzing these results, is we did exactly this. We introduced strangers and we said, okay, is the stranger introduction different from how we see the patterns after the removal and the reintroduction of those removed birds? So no news on that quite yet, but that should be coming. Yeah.
Exciting. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Baptiste. Our next question comes from Kaya.
Hello, I'm Kaya Tabak. I'm a postdoc at Hunter College CUNY in New York. Great talk. Thanks so much. I'm really sorry if I missed this, but I'm curious about what the mating system is and if the supporters are also mates or just friends or if they're kin, and also whether the supporters rank suffers when you remove their friend.
Yeah, these are great questions. So what we know so far from the wild is that it's pretty typical for the parakeets to form a socially monogamous bond. So either with another individual, or sometimes you do see trios of individuals even in the wild. So the trios that we're seeing in captivity are not completely unusual for the wild patterns. Generally, that's what we would consider to be kind of a mate bond, where it's usually, males and females forming those relationships, but not always. So they seem driven to form a strong partnership with another bird or two individuals in the group. And sometimes those are same-sex relationships. So that strong partner seems to be a really strong driver here. And then you had another question. Oh, what happens to the partners? This is also something that we were working on to try to see, what happens to the partners. So my student, Claire O'Connell, who I mentioned briefly at the end of the talk, she's working on social support, and she's trying to figure out, what does that abandoned partner do? How do they go through the decision-making process and repair? What does that process look like? And then can we try to figure out, how it's weighing the costs and benefits of staying with a new partner versus going back to that old partner? The partner isn't gone for very long, right? 8 days is really quick, but sometimes these birds are making decisions to stay with new partners rather than to go back to the old partner. So there seems to be a really interesting dynamic there. And so Claire's going to be looking at, how do those decision-making processes affect the remaining partner and that partner's rank? So, can they buffer their own rank loss against some of these perturbations?
Great. Thank you, Kaya. And now our question from YouTube. So this comes from Neville Pillai from South Africa. Great talk. Is the increase in bullying simply a response to a disruption rather than a formal hierarchical structure in this species?
Sorry, Adriana, can you say the first part again?
Yeah. So, well, it's Neville Pillai from South Africa. Great talk. And then, is the increase in bullying simply a response to a disruption rather than a formal hierarchical structure in this species?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we don't know currently with the results that I've shown you today, whether bullying is, just a reaction to a perturbation to the group membership like this, or if that's something unrelated to just the perturbation and it's a shift in kind of the group level decision-making process as a whole. So our next round of experiments are trying to get at that more and tease apart. Do we always see it go to bullying regardless of who we perturb? Or is it just when we take out the top ranked birds and then everybody else is trying to, retain the rank that they've then gained during that removal and keep that individual from reascending the hierarchy? So how much of a push and pull is there between the remaining individuals trying to keep a hold of their rank and prevent the removed individual from clawing their way back up? Yeah, so I think it's going to be really exciting to dig into that.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so our next question comes from Marcel.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I'm right now a science communicator, but originally coming from animal behavior background, and I'm highly interested in sociality and cognition, especially in parrots. And so I was kind of thinking about something similar to the question of Baptiste, in terms of the separation topic. So when have you ever tried basically to separate all the birds individually and then reintroduce them together in a group after the same separation period, like you would be doing with individuals?
Yeah, it's a great idea. So we haven't done it with the parakeets, but we have done it with the quail. So we've got a related kind of parallel project going on in the lab with our new quail system. So this is led by my PhD student, Sanjay Prasher. And what we're doing is separating the groups into individual cages every night. And then the next day we recombine them and we see like how much of the history from yesterday is structuring their behavior on the current day. So we should be able to get at that with those other experiments, but that's a potential experimental design that would be really interesting if we see results there, especially to take to the parakeet side and see, with the quail, we're kind of thinking maybe it's memory. Maybe they don't remember each other from yesterday, right? So that could be particularly exciting. So we've got them separated for different amounts of time. So overnight versus over a 3-day stretch, and then comparing that to a 17-day stretch. So we'll be able to look at the reformation of social structure following all of those forced absences, essentially.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. Our next question comes from Clara.
Yes, this is Clara B. Jones, retired social evolution. I'd like to thank you for the talk. I've been following your work since you were at NIMBIOS, so it's very nice to see what you're doing now. I'd like to push you a little bit on the issue of evolution. in your summary statement to find, and in your PNAS paper, the 21 paper, you have two statements. One, quote unquote, evolution of the use of social information. And the second, the evolutionary patterns underlying social cognition. Now, I'm assuming that what you're talking about is the evolution of the ways in which the brain uses social information. But I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how evolution fits into what is basically data that are approximately caused rather than ultimate.
Yeah, this is a great question. And again, thank you. I remember your questions from like back at Nimbus. So it's great to see you again. But yeah, so I think that the real power in addressing those kinds of questions are not within a single species. It's going and doing a comparative perspective across species. So for example, one of the things that I was thinking about a lot is for example, the close competitors social dominance pattern, right? Which looks like, you know, in a certain respect, if you've got a system where individuals are watching all the fights, remembering the fights that they have with particular individuals, watching the fights that other individuals have with particular individuals, integrating all that information, figuring out their rank in the hierarchy and the relative rank differences of everybody else, then the close competitor strategy is based on a ton of social information, requiring a lot of memory, a lot of processing and inferential skills. But you could get the same pattern of aggression using a very low cognitive skills or low kind of cognitive load type pattern. So you can think of a lot of fish, right, have a size-based hierarchy, and they focus their aggression on individuals that are slightly smaller than themselves. And so if you have that kind of system, it's going to look like a close competitor's, and it's going to be a close competitor's social dominance pattern, but it's going to be in the fish based on a size comparison where you could sub out those individuals and you might get the very same social dominance pattern. The individual identity doesn't matter as much as the characteristics of the individuals. Whereas on the parakeet side, we think that it's very much the social history and not the individual characteristics, so that those individuals are not interchangeable. And so I think that really highlights the differences in how individuals are taking in information, what kinds of things that they're able to perceive about each other, and how they're using that information. So for example, if the fish could recognize each other, and some fish do, right? Are they using that recognition, those recognition skills to structure their behavior, or are they using something simpler? In the parakeets, we can't find something simpler that they're using. So that's leading us more and more towards maybe it's cognitive because we can't find one of those kind of simpler rules. But you always have to be careful of going back and forth between going too far in the simple rules side of things and going too far in the cognitive side of things. But I think that gets at the evolution of the use of social information, is the different ways that individuals might be perceiving information and filtering it through their perceptive abilities, through their recognition abilities, through their memories, and their inferential abilities. And that can really change how what kinds of information are available for the decision-making process.
That just quickly leads me to push a little bit more. You state specifically in the 2021 paper and imply strongly elsewhere that the more information, the better. But we can show quantitatively very easily that as the linear cost curve increases and the benefit curve goes into asymptote, that there will be some kind of optimum. And the reason for that, well, there are many reasons for that, But one effect of that is that error is going to increase because noise increases as you increase the amount of information. So it seems to me that needs to be addressed, and seems to be an assumption of yours, but needs to be addressed. And also, obviously, at some point, if you're going to start talking about evolution, you have to talk about the reproductive costs and benefits, but perhaps more importantly, you have to show us how the phenomena you're studying influence what is going on at the population level, because evolution is a population process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. I mean, the experiments that we've done so far are much more on the social behavior kind of ecological scale than the evolutionary scale. So we don't have any information, for example, on how, we haven't looked at how rank affects, reproduction or fitness or things like that. And so I think I would push back a little bit on a couple things here. Is the information in the system, more information not necessarily is better, but it allows the species to be more flexible. So the more information that they can take in and process, the more possibilities that they have for changing the types of ways that they're interacting. So I think it just gives them more plasticity. So a species, like we were talking about the fish, for example, just a second ago, really doesn't have as many options for shifting. If the environment changes, some new individuals come in, there's a mutation where some individuals can recognize individuals and others can't. Those fish that can't process that information don't have the possibility of changing in that direction, whereas individuals that can actually do. So I think the connections with evolution are not direct, right? They're interesting implications, but not things that we've worked on directly so far. So I'd love somebody to dig into that. That would be amazing.
Thanks.
Thank you, Clara. And well, remember, if you have any other questions, just type in your question mark. As for now, I'm just gonna read 2 questions. One long question from YouTube. And so this is Avani from University of Vienna. Interesting talk. In the perturbation experiment, were the removed individuals kept alone? If yes, do you think it would have made a difference if they were kept with a pair or a few other individuals? I mean, in a social context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So in those perturbation experiments, the individuals were isolated from the main group, but they were moved back into a housing area where they were around. They were in vocal and visual contact with other parakeets over there. So they weren't housed in the same cage and allowed to physically interact with other parakeets, but they weren't totally isolated in kind of like a weird social environment for themselves. So one of the things that we're going to be manipulating in future experiments is letting those individuals have a partner when they're removed and have the possibility of physically interacting, and see if that changes some of the behaviors too. But they are in a social context when they're removed.
Great. I think there are no more questions from the YouTube. And since there are no questions here in the chat yet, I'll ask a question myself. I'll take the advantage. I have several questions, but I want to go with, I think at sort of the beginning of your talk, you were saying that the history mattered for not being able to recover that initial rank. But looking at the graphs, you could see that they had sort of a stable rank. So I would assume that if it didn't really matter, like if it does matter, if it matters, then they should have been able to recover their rank, and they didn't. Mm-hmm. So I'm conflicted with this like history and the actual result after the perturbation. So
yeah, and I think the question there is like, what's your definition of history, right? Is it short-term history, like the 8 days when they weren't there, or is it the momentum from the start of the entire experiment? So that's another thing that we've been playing around with in the lab and some of the analyses is how much momentum is there with the history, and is it the short-term history that really matters, or is it longer term history? And what you can see in the results so far is kind of a push and pull between the two, right? With the short term history seems to really matter because you put that bird back in, it cannot immediately like waltz back in and retake its previous rank. But you can see indications from Filippo's question is that the history beforehand of that individual being top ranked in the past might be one thing that allows it to slowly climb back up in the ranks after it's been reintroduced. And so I think there's a push and pull between the timescales here and how important the short-term history is versus the momentum of the longer-term history.
So maybe we could, instead of calling it history, could be experience.
That could work too.
Yeah, because if I think about history, then I think about like the past long-term sort of experience that I have. And that would lead me to a different result from the one I see in the experiment.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, awesome. I don't know if anyone else has any question or want to keep it the discussion, or maybe Liz want to tell us a little bit more about something that we haven't asked and you're eager to tell us.
Well, you can see we've got a lot of projects on a lot of things. So if anybody's interested in chatting about any of the other projects, I'd be happy to do that.
Clara has another question. So Clara.
Hi, since we have time, I have a question that I've been dying to ask a person who studies cognition. And again, it has to do with evolution. This is probably a really primitive question, and I apologize if it's a dumb question. But since selection cannot act directly on cognitive mechanisms, what do cognitive psychologists mean when they say that cognitive mechanisms evolve? Now, let me say one other thing to prove that I have been thinking about this. One way in which I could see that being addressed is if you were to say, in your case, for example, dominance behavior is genetically correlated, and the correlations are somehow associated with cognitive mechanisms. But anyway, how do cognitive mechanisms evolve?
Yeah, this is a good question. So, and also I'll preface this by saying that I'm not a cognitive psychologist. So I was firmly on the social side and kind of backed my way into like, oh, cognition is like probably something we should consider here with all these social processes. So I think that the way that I see it is there are certain things that come under selection pressure. So we see it like classic work in mate choice, right? So females get clued into specific kinds of signals and become really good at differentiating between categories or gradations of a signal for choosing mates, right? So you can think of the same kind of thing on the social side. So if individuals just get better at discriminating individuals from each other, right, doing that individual recognition process, then that's building up the cognitive mechanisms to do the recognition in a more kind of detailed way than they might have before. And so that then could allow them to differentiate those individuals and treat them on the social side as individuals rather than interchangeable agents, essentially. So that's one way that I think that cognitive mechanisms could get selected for is if there's a really strong benefit for doing that kind of differentiation. And we see indications that that kind of differentiation has been important in other contexts, like things like mate choice. So it's not unreasonable to think that on the social side of things, in a more general context, that could also be something that would be important.
Yeah, thanks. That is a good example. But the key thing is that there has to be genetic correlation between the phenomena you're talking about and the cognitive mechanism in order for that example to work.
Right. And so on the social side, if it's beneficial to differentiate individuals and beneficial in a reproductive context, right, they're able to better choose mates, better able to reproduce, then you could potentially get that genetic connection. But we don't know the genetic connection between a lot of these social behaviors and the cognition yet. So I think that's a huge area for future research.
Nice. From YouTube, we have Juan Riquelme, and it says a beautiful work. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Well, I think, well, there are no more questions on the chat or on YouTube. And unless someone wants to ask a question, I think we can just like close the YouTube live and we can relax and, chat more friendly.